My name is Nguyen, and I will be introducing the ABCX model today. The ABCX model was developed and presented by Reuben Hill in 1958 to provide the necessary framework to analyze the relationship between a stressful event and or crisis within the family. There are 4 variables to this model. A being the crisis or stressors and the causes of the stressors. This A interacts with B, which is the family's resources and how they use it to cope with stressors or resolve stressors. And that interacts with C, which is the family's perception of said stressors. How the family views the stressors can either negatively or positively impact the X variable, which is the crisis. X is the outcome of A, B, and C all working together, and the size of the crisis, whether it's minor or major, depends on how the family reacted during the ABC process. The A component of the model is the crisis or stressor, and the cause of it, which can change or disturb the equilibrium of a family. Stressors often can occur due to normal events, which are a part of everyday life and usually represents a change within the family. These normal events can be your children starting school, or a family member's death, or even retirement. All these things are a part of life, and we all know that it is bound to happen one way or another, but it does cause immense stress on a family and their relationship. Another way that stress can occur can be due to non-normative events, which are sudden and unpredictable. An example of this would be a natural disaster, or the sudden loss of a job, or even an accident. The way that a stressor can affect a family depends on the family's structure and how strong their bonds are with one another, the hardship that is occurring, and also the experiences that family has been through. So a new young family that just started out might have a harder time dealing and coping with a stressor compared to a family who has been through that situation before and knows what to do. The B component of the model is the family's resources, so what the family can use and depend on to help deal and adapt with the stress. So the first type of resource would be the family system's resources. So the family's bonds with one another plays a really big role in how the family can basically be protected or protect themselves from stressors and adapt during a stressful event or a crisis. A family with a strong and stable bond or relationship with one another has a higher chance of being able to cope or resolve stress compared to a family with a more strained or broken bond with one another. The next type of resource would be the community resources, which are people, institutions, and programs outside of the family. This can include charities, donations, clothes donations, food donations, or shelters for unhoused people. These are free programs and institutions that a family can rely on to provide the necessary things to live. Another resource would be social support, which would include the family's friends, their neighbors, or their relatives. These people can provide the family with emotional support, physical support, such as helping caring for children, helping around with household chores, and or even financial help. Michael Rossino himself stated in his piece on the ABCX model that some families have a better chance, per se, of coping with stress due to their material resources. So families that are financially stable or even comfortable has an easier time dealing and coping and resolving stress compared to a family that doesn't have that stability. Money tends to be a very big issue and a really big cause of stress for a lot of families. So to have the financial stability to be able to ease some of that stress does make some family have a higher advantage of coping with stress than others. The C component of the model is how a family perceives a stressor. So how they view a stressor can play a role in whether the crisis will occur or not, and the size of said crisis. In Michael Razzino's piece, he has stated that families that perceive a stressor in a negative light can actually cause a self-fulfilling prophecy, which means that they can cause a crisis to actually occur compared to a family who would view it in a positive light. So some families, they choose to believe in faith or spirituality when it comes to dealing with stressors. This gives them a meaning to the stressors and allows them to somewhat cope with the stressor, because they believe that it is God's will, God's plan for them, and that it is completely out of their control and they just have to let it pass. Believing in stressors in this way actually helps the family build more connections with other people who might be going through the same situation. This again also builds their social resources and social support, and can actually really help them cope and resolve the stressor. Meanwhile, other families believe that they can solve this problem, they can solve this stressor, and that they can take control of their lives. And so those families tend to work out the stressor together rather than just letting it pass. The X component of the model is the crisis. So it is the outcome of A, B, and C all working together. The level of the crisis or the severity of the crisis can depend on how much resources the family had, and basically just the severity of the event that caused the stressor. Like I said before, the crisis depends, can either occur or it won't occur depending on whether the family chooses to let the crisis basically shake up their lives and disrupt their lives. So families that work through the stress and don't let it get to them will tend to avoid the crisis compared to families that do. Despite the ABCX model being highly influential in the help to analyze stress within families, Razzino actually points out a major limitation within that model. The model only focuses on how a family can mitigate the stress, but not the crisis. So it focuses mostly on the beginning of a crisis rather than the crisis itself. And that's where McCubbin and Patterson came in and developed the double ABCX model to then focus on the crisis portion of a family stressful event. The ABCX model, which was presented by Hill, is considered the pre-crisis model. So the X from Hill's model feeds into McCubbin's and Patterson's model, the double ABCX model, which is considered the post-crisis model. And the double ABCX model is there to see how a family will adapt to said crisis over a long period of time. Similar to Hill's model, the double ABCX model has the same 4 variables, and each variable represents the same process of coping during a crisis. The only difference is the double ABCX model does show and represent the actions of a family during the crisis rather than during the stressor and before the crisis. The AA factor in the double ABCX model is the stress pileup. This usually means that the crisis occurred due to a continuation of the problem and the stress that occurred due to the problem. This usually involves the initial stress, the unresolved initial stress. So an example of this would be like Razzino pointed out, a child who is sick, terminally sick or chronically sick. That would lead the family into the next part of the stress pileup, which is the add-on amount of more stress, either due to the initial stress or completely unrelated to the initial stress. So Rosino gives an example of how if parents are dealing with a sick child, then they might become unemployed because they are constantly occupied with caring for their sick child, or they might run into money problems because they're caring for their sick child, and that is more stress that adds on into that initial stress. The last type of stressor that can cause a stress pileup would be the effects or the consequences of the family's attempt to cope with the stress. So having to constantly change the way they cope and constantly jump through hoops to try and resolve one stress at a time can actually cause more stress on the family. The BB factor in this model represents both the resources that a family had during the pre-crisis era and the new resources that the family has developed during this crisis. In order for a family to successfully be able to adapt to the current crisis, they would need a new set of resources that they can rely on or build on their current resources. This could include joining other communities or groups to help cope with the current crisis. Like if someone were to lose a family member and they join a grief counseling group or just another new friends who have been in the same situations, that is a great resource that they have built in order to adapt to the current crisis. The CC factor of the model represents the family's perception of the crisis. Redefining a crisis can actually help a family to better cope with the crisis and better resolve the crisis. Families who view the crisis in a more positive light are more likely to find ways to problem solve their issues. For example, families who are dealing with unemployment and the risk of not being able to afford living will be able to find ways to either apply for unemployment or use the free donations that lots of institutions and programs do give out. And so when they look at it in this more positive and endearing light, it becomes a bit easier per se for a family to cope rather than constantly looking at it in a negative light, which can more than often not cause depression or anxiety for a family. The XX factor is the final factor of the double ABCX model. It is the family's response to the crisis, the overall response, and the result of the family's adjustment during a crisis. This usually shows how a family has adapted over time through either bone adaptation or maladaptation. So if a family has adapted through bone adaptation, that usually means that they have adapted well and positively, compared to maladaptation, which means that they were unable to adapt and push through the crisis. But the help and thanks to both Hill's ABCX model and McCovern and Patterson's double ABCX models, their research has played a huge role and has become incredibly helpful for many fields that work with families who are going through stressful events or crises. It has really helped families identify, analyze, and also figure out solutions for such stressors.